1, 2.
I think we're live now. Thank you, everybody who is listening in live or joining us later. My name is Catherine Hoyt. I'm an instructor at Washington University, and my area of research is on early identification of developmental delay and intervention for young children with sickle cell disease and perinatal stroke. And today, we're here with OT Research First Fridays, should have flipped this order, which is a monthly series where we talk about different topics related to careers and research. And today we're going to be talking about submitting an abstract, what that means, where it goes, how to do it. And I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Kelly Harris. If you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Good morning. So I'm Kelly Harris. I'm an assistant professor of occupational therapy and surgery and public health sciences. And my research focuses on chronic disease, pediatric chronic disease, and educational outcomes. And so I think a lot about how complications of chronic conditions can impact opportunity and educational outcomes and engagement and participation for youth.
And then today, I guess I'll start us off by introducing Dr. Inema Orukari. Would you like to introduce yourself, or would you like me to talk about your accomplishments?
I can introduce myself, I guess. And then if you see fit, then you can supplement anything you
Okay.
Okay. So my name is Inema Orukari. I'm a recent graduate of WashU's MD PhD program, or MSTP, Medical Science Training Program. My background, I have a bachelor's in electrical engineering and a PhD in biomedical engineering. And I submitted abstracts to a lot of conferences across the world. So I have some expertise and perspective in doing that. So hopefully through our conversation with Catherine and Kelly, we will be able to help improve your understanding of research careers.
Thank you, Inema. I think the things you left out, so you are obviously an MD, PhD, and a lot of experience submitting abstracts everywhere in the world, but you also have experience as a mentor and with business development and the development of new ideas with Idea Labs now. What's it called now? It just flew out of my head. Oh, yeah. Thank you. I apologize. Could you tell us just briefly about some of the organizations that you're affiliated with where you've been involved in mentorship?
Yeah, so I've been involved with mentorships going back to undergrad. My first mentoring experience probably is with my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated. So with that, we did some rite of passage outreach with some youth in the Bay Area, Southern and the South Bay. And we also did some tutoring and mentoring with high school students at a high school in San Jose. Then I was involved with NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers, and in undergrad. And through that, we did some mentoring through their pre-college initiative. And then I was involved with SNMA as an undergrad. SNMA stands for Student National Medical Association. Through that, we did some outreach to the San Jose State community, where we taught people about health disparities and helped try to prepare people for medical school. And then when I got to WashU, I was involved with the Young Scientist program. I helped organize a continuing mentoring program where we paired graduate students and medical students with high school students at Southern High School and collegiate, I forget the acronym. I think it's CMS. I don't know the acronym off the top of my head. It was a newer high school that we added on, but high schools in the greater St. Louis community, or actually the inner city of St. Louis, we paired graduate students, medical students, and we paired graduate students and medical students with high school students who were starting off as freshmen, and had the mentoring relationship last the entirety of the high school students' high school career. And then I was involved with the National Society of Black Engineers again, with the St. Louis chapter, the alumni chapter, where we did some outreach through their pre-college initiative, where we taught elementary school kids about engineering. So I have a lot of mentoring experience. And yeah, so I'm happy to share from that perspective as well.
That's really excellent. I think, when I think about like my first experiences submitting an abstract, mentors were really crucial, right? Like, I think even that first kind of encouragement to submit an abstract is something often, as a student at least, kind of came from a mentor. So I think that that's really critical. Kind of jumping right in, let's talk a little bit about what an abstract even is. So what is an abstract? Well, what are we talking about? Are we talking about a full paper, kind of a short synopsis, or does it vary depending upon where we might be submitting abstracts?
So in general, an abstract is a summary of your work. It typically does not include all the details of what you did. It's shorter than a research article that's published in a journal. Typically, some fields use research abstracts as their papers, like computer science, but that is very field specific about the length and of the abstract, and also depending on the conference that you're trying to submit the abstract to, or whether or not you're writing an abstract for a journal article, the abstract can vary in length. So I've submitted abstracts that were, had character limits of like 300 characters, which were very difficult to write because you have to figure out how to convey all you did in a concise manner, and that typically results in you using a lot of jargon. So you end up learning how to speak concisely your scientific efforts. Then also on the opposite side of the spectrum, I've written abstracts that felt like they were papers. They had figures, they had a background, an objective, methods, conclusion, or results in a conclusion section, and so it really depends on the conference or the journal that you're submitting the abstract to. So the beauty of it is that you get to target what journal you want to send your stuff to.
Yeah, so that was excellent information, and it's bringing up two additional kind of thoughts for me. I think so. My background is in education, and I came to the medical school from a department of education where things were very not completely different, but like our conferences were a little bit different. So oftentimes our abstracts were longer. But you mentioned that they're kind of a summary of a published or publishable paper. And so a question actually that came up this week from one of my students is whether or not we can submit abstracts for things that we've already published. And I know like in a lot of fields, you can't submit an abstract like to present at a conference if it's already published somewhere, but it sounds like there are also times and places where you can, or like you said, that the abstract itself becomes published in a journal. And then, so that was one thing I was thinking about. And then I kind of heard you describing really the difference between like a structured abstract where, it's got these specific sections versus kind of an unstructured, really, short 300 character kind of concise few sentences. So yeah, any thoughts about, published paper versus publishable paper? Are there guidelines like that?
Yes, usually the conference will tell you if you can present published data, but typically, most of the conferences that I've published abstracts in required that the data be new. But I have seen some conferences that allow published data to be presented. And if they do, that's a good way to get your work out and let people see, be a little evangelist of your work and your lab and your field.
That makes me think of another question that I'd like to ask you your opinion on. Who should be submitting abstracts? The three of us are from different fields.
Who should be submitting abstracts? Someone that's knowledgeable about the work that you did and can, I guess, highlight the strength of the paper. Someone who can explain what impact the paper will have on the field. And typically or at least when I wrote an abstract, I had a list of authors on my paper and they all contributed to drafting the abstract. I usually wrote like the first draft of the abstract and then sent it out to my fellow authors. And then they added critiques. They helped, with jargon. So they help put in words that are specific to the field that would make an idea more concise. They or they helped add context to some of the statements that I was trying to make when I left out the context. So I feel like anyone who is familiar with the work should submit an abstract and not be afraid to do so, because you typically get help along the way with drafting your abstract.
For my unmute here, the one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about sending it out for comments is, and when we think about like character counts, which as you said, right, the smaller the character count, the harder they can be to write. I like to always also have that person who can get it down within the character count, right? There's always somebody who can cut out my unnecessary words or help me, say the same thing more simply. To meet those character counts. So thinking about having editors for kind of different things, right? Like you definitely need someone to help kind of build and make sure it's clear and the content is there, but also somebody who can get your word count down.
I think another thing that you mentioned, so you mentioned a whole lot of things in that, like who's authored on the abstracts. It can be a bunch of people. It's not necessarily just one person submitting it. It's probably a group. And that mentorship and making sure it's the strongest abstract that it can be, so it has a higher likelihood of being accepted. But then also thinking about that structure that really people very early in their career can start submitting things to conferences. It's not always those senior people. It's someone who's looking to contribute to the field, who's looking to get more involved and maybe network and share their work with other people. And develop those relationships with different mentors. Do you have, and we've talked a bit about already like the different things that an abstract could include, but I'm wondering if we could just elaborate a little bit more, like what are those different parts of an abstract, and what does structured versus unstructured mean?
Yeah, so a structured abstract typically includes a background section, which provides context to the work. It usually has a problem statement, and it has maybe what work is relevant or similar to what the work you are publishing in your abstract um, is, and then for the objective, some of them have objective sections where it's usually like one sentence that provides the problem statement if you didn't include it in the background. You can have a results section or a method section where you detail the conditions that you looked at in doing your experiments. So, you know, you list, if you're doing chemistry-based research, then you might list out reagents or chemical compounds that you used, and how you mixed them together, how much time you did that in, or you ran the reactions for, and things like that. If you're doing like a OT-based project, you probably would list your cohorts, your different groups that you are including, and what's specific about those groups that make them different. You might want to talk about your types of statistical analysis that you've done. For the results, you talk about the results of the statistical analysis. You might have some pictures, some figures. For conclusion, you tie everything together, and you go back and tell people how your work fits in the field and possibly changes things or adds insight to the issue that you're dealing with. And then for the unstructured abstract, you have it's typically like a couple sentences, like maybe one paragraph where you detail, where you summarize your work, kind of go through all the sections of the structured abstract, but in a more concise manner, and you only do the highlights. You don't really go into all the different conditions that you did, and all the different groups that you included, or all the statistical analysis that you've done. You mostly try to almost do like the equivalent of what is it? Just making a headline of your work, but in an extended manner.
I think that's helpful, distinguishing between the structured and, maybe even having the labels and all those different sections laid out versus just kind of given that those key points, takeaways in the unstructured abstract. The other thing that I just wanted to point out that I've heard both of you mention that our listeners should just be aware of is some abstracts are published after once they're accepted, and some are not. And that's something to be aware of if it's an abstract with data or findings that you're ready to share, and something to talk to your mentor about if you're preparing a manuscript for publication, and things like that. So just something to look at as you're considering where to submit.
Bringing up where to submit, I want to kind of talk about that next, but just before we jump there, we talked a little bit about who's authored on an abstract, but not specifically. And I do think that, so as someone who made the mistake of missing people on an abstract submission some years ago, like really thinking about that and talking to your mentor, because that can vary between departments. And like I said, I came from education where single authored work is kind of acceptable, to the med school where single authored work is really frowned upon, right? It's like, it's not kind of how we do things. So I think having an actual discussion about that can be helpful if it's, especially for students, if you're just not sure. Sometimes students don't even know who all worked on something, right? Or like who all has been engaged in the data to know who to include. So I know we kind of touched on it, but just to add that as a point. But then moving on, yeah, you talked about where to submit. So how do we decide where to submit an abstract and what type of presentation to submit for? You know, are there different types, and how should we kind of think about that?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question, how to decide. Um, so there are, I guess, a couple strategies that you can use to pick where you want to target your abstract for. One is you could look at the audience that you want to get feedback from. So submit an abstract to a new field that your work is relevant to, and try to get published there. Or you can, another one is find a location that you want to go visit, and if your work is relevant to the conference, it's a good way to get out and travel the world. So that's another strategy that I use. It's it's perfectly okay to pick a conference that's in a good location that you want to see, as long as you're actually doing the work of presenting your work to the audience, and the audience is a legitimate scientific group. I think then picking a conference based on location is okay. Also, you can pick a conference based on, so I said you can pick a conference based on feedback that you want to get, or you can pick a conference based on trying to inform or raise awareness of a particular issue. So if you feel like a field needs to have awareness raised, you can submit your abstract to that conference so that maybe you can get more readership for your work. And then for your second question, you said, what are the different types of presentations you can give?
Yeah, like how do you think about what type to submit for? Should you submit for a poster or?
Yeah, so a poster presentation is, in usually a hall where you stand by a poster that has like your different sections on it, your background, methods, results, and conclusions, and it has figures and diagrams and statistics and stuff, so that you can have a good relationship or interaction with your audience. It's very intimate. So if you're earlier in your research and you want to get feedback, a poster is an excellent way of getting feedback in a low stress situation. Yeah, and if you have issues with public speaking, then not issues, but like if you are afraid of public speaking, a poster presentation is something that's low stress, and you can have that one-on-one presentation interaction with someone. If you feel like your work is more developed and more mature, then you should probably submit to a like a podium presentation, like a PowerPoint presentation. Those are considered more prestigious in the realm of academia. You typically don't have people interrupting you as you present, so you can tell your story the way you want to tell it. And at the end, people will ask questions, and they typically limit the number of questions because they're always considering time crunches. So yeah, if you feel like your work is more mature, I would say do a poster, a PowerPoint presentation, a podium talk. because those are more prestigious. But if you feel like you want your work is not as developed and you want the feedback in an intimate setting, then you should probably consider doing a poster.
I like how you described the different types of conferences and how you could consider either presenting within your field to share your work, or even thinking about other fields and where you could go to expand the reach, really, because I know for all of us, our work isn't just siloed in the one field, and could benefit from people in many fields hearing about it. I know, like for me in OT, for example, we have the AOTA National Conference where many people attend, and that's a larger meeting. So you could get greater input from people at like a poster presentation like you were describing. But coming up, if there's any OTs listening, there's OT Summit of Scholars, which is a much more intimate conference with only like 200 people, where you can get more of that feedback, like really feedback on your research ideas and questions. So it's really, I think, thinking about what's your purpose of presenting, what do you want to get out of it, and who do you want to share this with, what level. Like I like how you described that as, introductory. If you're seeking feedback, maybe a poster is better, versus if it's a more developed outcomes, maybe the podium talks are a good way to go. I don't know. Do you have anything else to add to that, Kelly?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think I've seen some conferences. So in education, for example, we kind of have a middle ground too. There's like these round tables that you can submit to where it's not a podium talk, but you do still have to do an oral presentation of your work, but to like a small, to 6 people, right, that have similar work and that give feedback. And so there are different types of, that's one version of kind of a in between the poster and the podium. And then the one thing I think we didn't talk about, and I really have experience with this outside of attending, but submitting for like a course, right? Or kind of a workshop type presentation where you're maybe not just sharing one piece of work, but kind of a broader conceptual content. So I don't know if either of you want to touch on that, but thinking about like submitting a short course or a workshop. Do either of you have experience there?
I haven't reached that stage in my career where I'm teaching people courses on material. I've enrolled in courses. So typically you should be more, you should be more familiar with your field and be able to educate someone who is a novice to your field. I don't have much experience with that, but I definitely have seen those types of presentations.
Any thoughts, Catherine?
I think so, but this is, I think, a thing where it might differ between like your, I think a lot of your presentations, Inema, have been focused on your research. And for me, I do research, but you're also a clinician. We're all also clinicians in different areas. And I've done short courses, not necessarily on my research, but on like teaching different like clinical skills or talking about things that aren't necessarily research topics, but are like in-depth discussions about theory or practice or things affecting practice in different ways. Or the development of ideas, like with COTAD, we've done a number of presentations on the development of ideas, basically for the purpose that you were saying of like, how can we recruit more people, more interest? So we did presentations for that purpose, which is a little bit different than scientific presentations.
I think it makes me think of a related point. We could probably have a whole separate discussion on this, but I think there's value too in remembering as we're submitting abstracts and as we're preparing to share our work that even when we're kind of early career or students or, kind of more novice, we are still experts in what we did and in that particular thing, right? And so you might not be senior in your field or an expert in the field broadly, but I think preparing that abstract and coming to, conferences and meetings, remembering that we do have something worth sharing, right? And I think for me, at least, as a student, you know, I kind of felt like I don't know what everybody already knows when I get there, right? And I had to kind of remind myself that that there is a component of this, at least, that is kind of my thing to share, if that makes sense. So I don't know. I think, yeah, just thinking about that as you're preparing it, that you know, your particular, whatever it is you're submitting, you know that well, and probably better than at least some of who will be attending, right? So just kind of a thought. I think, I don't know, the only other question I have that's kind of, that we haven't really touched on, is thinking about when you're writing for reviewers, what does that mean? Like, what are reviewers looking for when they're reviewing abstracts? And that's a broad question, but you know, I think I'm thinking about, you know, are you responding to a call of some kind, or are you just submitting to kind of a broad, like, what, you know, how do you consider what the reviewer might be thinking about and having to consider as they review your abstract?
Okay. So I guess when I write my abstract, I don't really think about, you know, what the reviewer is gonna say or ask. I typically try to focus on, you know, sharing the idea that I'm trying to convey to my target audience. So I really think about the audience. So maybe, I guess you could say that the reviewers represent, you know, the state of the field that you're trying to present your work to. And so, you know, you need to think, where is the field at currently? What are the issues or things that you're trying to address? You need to say, you know, explain why you chose to do your study in the way that you did it. In the longer form abstracts, that's what you would want to do, like explain why you chose to do your study in the method you want, or give alternatives in the conclusion section or discussion section, depending on how you structure your presentation, your abstract, I'm sorry. Really, you need to just be intentional about, you know, the words you're trying to convey, and the ideas that you're trying to share with your audience. Think about, what would a typical person in the field that I'm presenting to think about this work?
So I think you just brought up a couple really good points, that you want to make sure that you are writing to the audience that you're submitting to. So if you're submitting to a group of engineers, that it's language that they will be able to interpret and understand and has value within that field, and that you're creating content that applies to building that particular field that might be of interest to the people that would be attending that conference. And then the other thing I heard you say is the importance of it being really clear, so that the reviewer really understands what you did and why it's important for that specific audience. And I think those are probably some of the things that make an abstract successful. Do you have any other tips or suggestions that you'd want to give to people that are submitting an abstract for their first time?
One tip is to look, if you have access to it, look at other abstracts from that field or that conference that were published previously, and try to structure your abstract in that manner.
or if you find people who are doing similar work, see how they condense their words, their writing, so that they convey their ideas, because you might be able to figure out a way to word your idea in a more concise, succinct manner. So looking at examples is very helpful. And just, seeking, advice from people in your lab or people in your research group who have done it before, because that is a part of the academic training. You're getting mentored by many different people, your advisor, your formal PI, or people in the lab. They're learning how if they desire to have a research career and run a lab or run a research group, they need to learn how to mentor younger, more junior, or not necessarily younger, but more junior researchers. So don't think that you're bothering them, that you're actually helping them gain the skills necessary to be successful in the future.
That, I think, is a great way to sum it up. Speak up, ask for help when you need it, talk to the people around you, and get examples. So now, if somebody has submitted, they've found a conference that is in a place they're interested in a field they want to share their ideas or research in, they've put the content together and submitted it on the website. Usually it's a website for abstract submission, I think always now. What happens next after you've submitted an abstract?
So it really depends on the conference. Some conferences want you to publish only on the stuff that you submitted in the abstract. And there might be some lead time in between the conference or between the abstract and when you submit the abstract and when you present. Some conferences allow you to actually change your presentation based on the new data. So an abstract isn't binding. You can you want to present the truth. So if you find out that something was wrong in your abstract, it's totally fine. In general, it's fine to present the real results, even if it goes against what your abstract says. We're trying to, most academic institutions are out to seek the truth, and so present the truth, what you found. So after writing your abstract, you might be collecting additional data, or to present in the presentation, or you might be using your abstract, the data that you present as an abstract, to make your presentation.
So related to that, usually in your experience, how far ahead of a conference do you have to submit an abstract, and when do you find out if it was accepted?
That's variable too. Some conferences, allow you to present, require you to submit your abstract up to maybe even, I think I've heard of a year, maybe 9 months or 6 months. A considerable amount of time in between the abstract submission and the actual presentation. And then there's some conferences have late breaking abstracts, things like that, where they allow you're allowed to submit abstracts closer to the presentation date, maybe up to 3 months, 2 months to even a month before the conference. It really depends on the field and the conference that you're submitting to.
And then you can expect notice about that abstract sometime ahead of the conference date.
Yeah. Probably enough time for you to make arrangements to find housing and room and travel and things of that nature.
And then just for anybody who's listening, we do have another conversation about conferences if you're interested in listening more about that and how people find funding to attend conferences or choose the conferences to attend. But I think that's helpful advice when thinking about the abstracts. You know, you have to plan in advance. Can't just plan a few weeks ahead of time to present. Anything else that anybody would like to share related to submitting an abstract?
I think this is great. This is a lot of information.
Thank you so much, Inema, for joining us to talk about submitting an abstract for the first time. Anything else that you'd like to add?
Yeah, submitting an abstract can be daunting, you know, when you first do your first, when you do your first abstract submission. You just got to remember that you are typically in a trainee role, and you can reach out for help, ask questions, get examples, and try to have fun while you're doing it.
And on that note, I think we're all done.